Hello, everybody. I'm joined by a subscriber, Memories of the Future. He was watching my stream on the economics of the USSR, and he made some comments that he wanted to address and discuss certain things about the Soviet economy that I guess I didn't get right or I didn't get a chance to review in that previous stream. So, yeah, he's got a YouTube channel. I linked it in the description if you'd like to check that out. But yeah, how you doing today, man?
Hey, thank you for having me. Let's get this show on the road.
Yeah. Hold on. Let me ping the server real quick so that. Yeah, let me go ahead and ping the server. And then. Yep.
Ping everybody, abuse the everyone option.
There we go. All 300 people, of which we've got about, what, 30 online. So yeah, there we go. That's a potential audience of 30 people. But yeah, we were talking about some things in the before we started the stream. I mean, we were already kind of getting started, but what first would you like to address or talk about as we get the show?
Okay. Do you remember any of the points I was making in your last video? So to have.
I mean, all I remember is that you mentioned that I misunderstood the nature of shortages within the socialist countries. But I could reiterate what exactly my original point was. Basically, because prices were not set according to the market, they were set by planners. So they had a tendency to subsidize or sell their goods below market prices. So like books, food, housing, these things were extremely cheap. And because of this, because there wasn't really like apt price rationing, like the potential for shortage was there, as well as like on top of like the propensity for like managers to hoard their productivity. Basically, there weren't really good incentives later on to be more efficient and productive. And sometimes the state would make wasteful investments that ended up costing them in the long run. But I don't know. What's your perspective on the commie shortages?
Oh, okay. So you just thrown us directly into the deepest depths of the most deepest pit. So the thing with shortages is sort of like anything with Soviet Union and the Eastern Bloc is a multi-layered problem, because on one side, yes, economically you are totally correct. So the price control and all sorts of price politics imposed top down by the government created problems. But there is a huge aspect I believe most people forget and don't necessarily have the will to address it. And that is the problem of corruption. Okay, and at a certain point, yes, you have shortages because the industries are inefficient. But the more you impose certain politics, including the bringing the everybody into the workforce. Okay, that one side sounds like, wow, that is great. Everybody had a job. But the same policy, if we look on how it manifested in reality, created more problems than it solved. Because yes, you would solve on paper if you have a 10-point checklist. Yes, you can check that out. Oh, everybody is working. But on the other side, you have a good chunk of the working force which is severely unprepared and severely unqualified. Okay, and in that moment, those shortages are not only created due to your price policies, they are also created due to the problem that people are simply inept, are bad at their jobs, and they create problems not only in production but also in distribution, and that would be sort of the lower level of the problem with the least complexity. The other level of the problem would reside with the management, and that means that if you are, I don't know, maybe a farm, technical complex, and you need to produce this much amount of cow heads, cattle heads, or something like that, for the meat industry, to be processed into more processed meats and canned meats and so on, and you don't meet that quota, you risk your job. like you seriously are at the risk of losing your job. But you can easily see if you can bribe somebody to send you a share of their production, and thus, instead of, I don't know, a 10% deficit, to report only a 5% deficit. Okay, so there was this kind of not only black market, but a second layer of
Yeah,
corruption
yeah, the
active, which,
second economic activity. I actually talk about that not as in depth as I wanted to during the last stream, but yeah, there was second economic activity like fraud, the running of underground factories as though they were capitalist, as well as just the theft of the state, people just stealing medicine, like doctors stealing medicine and selling them under the table, or factory workers or managers basically hoarding some of the supplies and then selling it on the black market. Like underground economic activity was fairly widespread. Based on the estimates I've seen, by the year 1980, about 10% of Soviet economic activity could be estimated being done through the second economy.
yeah. And that is a number I do remember. And there is another thing. I believe that number truly lacks context. Okay, because it might be accurate, it might be not accurate, but 10%, what does 10%? Because if we talk, let's say, about the population, 200 million people, but I will just pull the number out of thin air. You have a population of 20 millions or 200 millions, and you have 10% corruption. What does that mean? 10% of the population is corrupt? And actually, no, while there was corruption spread easily found amongst the general population, at the lowest level, at your average Ivan, average Joe worker, that thing wasn't a thing which would affect. Yes, when you talk huge amounts of population into the mass, but the vast majority of this corruption would be concentrated in the mid and top tier level of the government and of the administration, and that paints a completely different picture, because right now we can talk about clans, we can talk about factions, and they are not only ideological factions, say, I don't know, Trotskyist versus other faction. Okay, no, you have the faction of this mayor of this, the leader of this region, competing with other leaders from other region to take a better control, and thus we take more money from bribery from within that area. And now we are talking about a completely different type of economy, which is like extremely difficult to be caught on paper and reported.
Yeah, yeah. From what I understand, again, this comes back to a lack of oversight, lack of ability to catch it, because they were still doing a lot of their planning on paper, as far as I know, all the way up until the 70s. Like grocery stores in the Soviet Union didn't even have barcodes. So, like, of course, it's going to be next to impossible to track and monitor where resources are going and what's being done. Like, modern corporations of scale today are, on the other hand, very good, relatively good at loss prevention, like knowing where things are at and where they're going. Like, I mean, I work in a warehouse. I scan boxes and stack them inside trailers. What's the point of me scanning the box? It's to track where the item's at. It's to track where it's going. So, but the Soviets didn't have something like that, and that's just an example of a larger overarching problem. So, the lack of oversight. I mean, the reason why the early Soviet Union worked so well before it went revisionist, quote unquote, is because under Stalin, people were actually like, not only were they actually motivated through the pioneering spirit because it's a post-revolutionary society. On the other hand, I mean, there was the state apparatus was also very strong under Stalin. Like it was very tightly knit together, and also like he was basically the liquidator. He pretty much liquidated those who pretty much opposed the overall plan, and even some of those who actually went along with it. But that's a different conversation. But without, the carrot and the stick of Stalin around, people wanted more. And the issue is the regime basically slowly went cynical over time. So my point is that by the 1970s, the other thing is by the 1970s, the very same policies that they used to recruit the rural unemployed into the cities and get them employed and getting them to work, like you said, it was a good policy. But on the other hand, a lot of those same policies, which helps them explode their economy within the first few decades, were now starting to like undermine prospects for future growth. So really what they needed by the 1970s, I believe, I mean, along with updating information technology, is basically deliberately automating as much as possible, and which they were doing. There were advances being made. But the other thing is they just needed a new strategy. What do you think? Do you think they just needed a new strategy? That's what I think.
Yeah, I would also go with the completely different strategy, especially since, like you said, and I surprisingly, or not surprisingly, because we've talked before, I do agree that under Stalin and under the threat, the conditions of Second World War, Stalin literally had a free hand to clash, to smash every dissent and go heavy hand on anything that wasn't being done properly. But here we need to go again with a quality and quantity policy, because if you are under the threat of Second World War, of Nazi Germany and stuff, and during and immediately after, if the top bosses, the top party decides, hey, look, you need to build this factory, they'll say, well, sure, of course, we will build this factory, and you are in charge. If after 6 months that factory or 1 year is not built and the section of it is missing, somebody can come and they will shoot you, send you to Gulag or any other measure of bad things. But after that, after all the factories were built, I believe that the Soviet Union really lacked a system of how to check for quality, because you can see, hey, do we have a fully operational factory which can produce steel of this quality to produce T-34s? Yes or not? It was a simple question. But when you go out from this one-minded war type of economy to something more complex, then the amount of what would be quantitative markers gets much higher, and I believe they literally didn't thought about that, and this lapse was severely undermined by their manifestation in the reality. And here is the practical thing: I believe they lost the Soviets, and of course other bloc lost the contact with reality since the 50s and 60s, because that was the moment when managers saw that they could be kept in power regardless of their outcome, regardless of their efficiency and how they really ran their factories.
Yeah.
As long as they were somewhere around the numbers, everybody could lie and move on, and everybody in the party was happy. But if it was the case of wartime economy, like it's also the case with U.S. Army in Second World War, they said right, they are talking that the U.S. Army was so efficient because they could dispose of generals and leadership very easily, and it wouldn't be seen as something bad. It was normal. Hey, you had your chance, you missed the chance. Now go back a couple of stages on the rank.
Yeah. What you're saying is absolutely right. Their incentive system was messed up because their system was prioritizing just it's what I described as productivism in the last stream. The Soviets got caught up in productivism, or just achieving greater and greater quantities produced with no consideration for quality. And they also had so under capitalism, there's an incentive to be more efficient in the sense that you have cost effectiveness. Because as a capitalist, if I run a private firm, if I can save money on labor by automating and advancing productive forces, if I could save money on material and get more out of less and less and be more efficient, this is just what Marx analyzed. That's how capitalism becomes more efficient or drives efficiency in the productive process. It drives efficiency in the productive process because there is an incentive, because the more you can save money, the less you spend on labor and constant capital and variable capital, the more money that you can reap in the form of profits, raise the rate of exploitation, and enrich yourself. Such an
So,
incentive was, I mean, the only incentive that they had in the Soviet Union was like the pursuit of numbers. That's what they were pursuing, just more and more. They
sure,
didn't really
but
have, they didn't really have, as far as I could tell, like much incentive to be more efficient in the production process in that regard.
yeah, let me quickly get in there. I believe this talk about efficiency is a bit not necessarily out of context. I believe it lacks a more appropriate context, because up until a point, you are totally correct. The capitalist system definitely wants to be more efficient and will deploy certain tactics. But if we look today at, I don't know, iPhone, Apple, for a couple of generations, they pretty much streamlined their production efforts. Okay, they put as many machines they could. They did all the evil shit with their workforce, moving it outside and putting safety nets and all the other stuff. But ultimately, right now, they are in a moment where they are like taking away features. They are taking away your headphone jack and stupid stuff like that, and that is another form, another layer, which is might be seen as efficiency, but I believe that although it mimics, it looks like a duck, quacks like a duck, but ultimately I don't think it's about efficiency. So somehow we should find a common ground and come up with a better understanding of what efficiency is, especially in today's context, because not everything that looks like efficiency is efficiency.
Well,
Does it make
I'm
sense?
I'm talking about like cost efficiency. Like that's mainly what I was talking about. I understand that there's different contexts and words for the term, but I'm talking about within the production process itself how much you can produce. Do I think capitalism is a sustainable, efficient system in with respect to like true economic calculation? No, not at all. We have planned obsolescence over production cycles. We have sex of the population that we just let hoard like untold amounts of resources and wealth. I mean, there's a lot of reasons why capitalism isn't efficient. And the Soviet system was more efficient than capitalism in a number of regards. But I'm more specifically talking about the inefficiencies and deficiencies that they did have to deal with under their model of socialism.
Yeah, well, what I was talking about is that we both can agree that Apple went through several things that there is no counter argument that those things were efficientizing the process. But taking away the headphone jack is not, I don't know, 1-2%, couple of percentage might be efficientizing, I don't know, money, streamlining production processes and stuff like that. But the amount of efficiency in this kind of stuff is too smaller to be a truly efficient to be truly categorized as efficiency thing. And I believe this kind of stuff was also happening in Soviet Union when every decision that the system was taking at that time was put under the umbrella, like we are putting now under. But they were also justifying back then, and we are also perpetuating the same narrative that every decision was under the input of either efficiency or cost. There would be I don't know, a global etiquette, a global tag, a global thing, and I believe that thing needs to really be looked into it and break down and rephrased to properly understand what happened, where exactly was the disconnect between what the leaders thought and what the industry put out, if that makes better sense.
Right, right. Oh, I thought so. Then go ahead. Why exactly? I guess what I'm trying to ask is where you're going with this. Like, what's the overall point that you're trying to make?
Well,
Uh,
um, While I do agree that largely plenty of things in Soviet Union and of course Eastern Bloc were done under the target of achieving quotas. Okay, that's
Yeah.
there is no dismissal of this point, but somewhere there is a deeper discussion of quality because at each
Yeah.
point we can see Soviet Union and of course satellite states trying to steal technology from the West or buy it, license it, and all sorts of other stuff and deploy it. So they did these efforts, but those efforts were, I don't know, maybe limited to the military complex, military technology, okay, and they didn't spill into the general population, okay. But we really need to make this statement because then we can more efficiently address and properly understand what exactly the leadership wanted for the people, and when we will say that, hey, look, the Soviet Union achieved this ABCD for the Soviet population, what it really meant, because usually it's a kind of yes, but actually no.
Hmm. Yeah. So, I mean, that is like a point as well. Like a lot of technology that they developed was, I mean, they developed a great deal of innovative technology, but I mean, that is another issue that a lot of that innovation didn't go over to the consumer end of the economy. So, like, most people didn't really see, a lot of people actually didn't really see the benefits of a lot of that technology that was being developed by the Soviet military industrial complex. The idea that, like, the MIC and the Cold War and their military industrial complex did put some degree of strain on their economy, but it's not as much as people think. Like,
See, this is a thing, I believe, a place where we can make a sort of qualitative differentiation. Because, yes, that the Cold War maybe wasn't having an impact on the military, or sorry, on the economy, but it definitely impacted all the decisions which affected the general population.
yeah,
And that's a thing that it isn't really drawn out in these things. Oh, look, Soviet Union built plenty of houses, or Soviet Union had great healthcare. Okay, it's forgotten because ultimately, yes, they had plenty of houses, and yes, plenty of those houses were of poor quality, so to say. But was it because the system wanted to put out cheap housing at a cheap quality? Why exactly is that? Because if we can understand this kind of decision making, then we can understand where they went wrong. Because ultimately, I believe this is kind of the fears of the party, the fears of the people in top decision places.
I completely agree. I think it ultimately came down to that. Like, it's the reason why they didn't introduce cybernetics sooner, because they had a tried and true tested method of doing something, and the conservative elements of the party were afraid to take a risk on something new. I mean, that's really what it came down to. A lot of them were afraid of taking risks on a lot of the issues, and some of the issues just got ignored for decades as well. And they just kept going with what they knew worked, because, again, they didn't want to pioneer and experiment with something new that could potentially flop. So I think you're 100% right in that regard. What I have before me is a list of, like, reforms that I think could have salvaged the regime if introduced, properly. You see the list?
Oh yeah, can you zoom in a bit?
All right,
Or
hold on.
let me see
I,
if
I
I
can
increase my.
I can see
Okay.
about that. I mean, is hold on. There we go.
Mhm. Oh, these are great topics.
Shoot. Anyways, yeah. So I talked about this near the end of the last stream on the subject, but
Mhm.
party purge, get rid of everybody to the right of Stalin, get rid of all of them. No more social democrats, no more libs. No, just get rid of all of the people who are either libs or potentially libs. Like, so Gorbachev and Yeltsin are out. And here's what you could do. Here's exactly what you could do to get these kinds of people out. Do glasnost like a bait and switch. You say we're opening up. We're giving people the freedom to express themselves. We're going to do what Mao did with like the 100 flowers, let people express themselves. And everybody that expresses liberal sentiments, you're out of the party. That's how you would do it. And then next thing is term limits. I think that the issue is the Soviet Union eventually became a gerontocracy where all of like the top government officials were 70 and 80-year-old men who've been in politics their whole lives. And I feel like this is what creates the argument for the nomenclatura, or the sect of the ruling clique that basically has a different set of interests from the workers. So term limits and sortition democracy, because it would make the system more democratic and give more people an opportunity for leadership. A second round of education and propaganda to build enthusiasm for and excitement for the next stage of socialism. That's what it would be.
Just 1 second before getting into the education. See, here are like a couple of problems, and this is not necessarily something inherent, embedded in socialism or communism or whatever. It's embedded in every system, because in order to, on one side, you have these people who will get to be politicians like Biden up until they are 90, and you literally bury them when they are still in their position, in their elected positions. Okay, so that's a huge problem, and I do agree term limits should be put in place. But the other thing, this thing will give you two problems. One, what will you do with the people around them? Because Biden, for example, or Stalin wasn't by itself. They literally had huge groups of people who would spew the same things as him, who would try and put every paperwork and file every paper and write every study and every number, every statistics favorably to Stalin, to Biden, and whoever was in charge. So you kind of need to get rid of those people, but that will leave you with the next problem. You would have a limit. Always have a limited amount of people, and even if you go to the size of China and you have 1 billion people, you'd still need to have universities where you'd train those people in a certain doctrine, and you will recruit those people as early as you can into your own personal group of power. So you would make sure that they would be loyal, extremely loyal to your personal group. So how can you solve this kind of problem? Because if you want to eliminate, I don't know, Stalin or whatever leader, you would need to eliminate a huge amount of apparatski and bureaucrats, okay? And you suddenly have no people to replace them with.
Well, not necessarily. So when I talk about term limits, shut up, my dog's here, but when I'm talking about term limits, I'm also referring to sortition democracy. So you have people in these important decision-making roles, but the point would be, rather than treating them as basically a status above average workers, it should just be treated as though it were another job. And I know bureaucrats in the USSR weren't like super wealthy relative to the general public, but what I do know is that the idea here is, what do you know of sortition democracy?
Oh, please get into its details. It's good for everybody.
So, sortition democracy is the general idea that you have a pool of candidates that are qualified for a position. You train, I don't know, 100 people for this position. With sortition, nobody drafts a vote. There's no voting. What it is that someone is chosen from the pool of qualified candidates at random, and they serve a term limit. This person can be recalled. There's, oversight and accountability, checks and balances, and so on. But this person serves a, say, 5 to 10 year term. They serve their term, and then once their turn is up, they return to that pool, and then the dice is rolled again on another candidate, so that and you train as many people as possible for these positions from the general public. You get as many people involved as possible so that you have a nice wide pool of qualified candidates. And, every 5 years, it's like the lottery. Like every 5 years, hey, you have been chosen by the party to fill this role. Would you like to? Yay or nay? If nay, then roll again and pick somebody else. This way, while they're not being a bureaucrat, they're a worker. And when they get picked to be a bureaucrat, they still have the same psychology of a worker. And this makes it so that you don't have an entire group of individuals who are just in politics for decades at a time, who basically eventually develop a psychology of elitism or a psychology of interests that are different from the rest of the working class. Because this is ultimately what happened in the USSR. I mean, it ended up getting betrayed by a clique of liberals who infiltrated the party, basically. I mean, and this could help prevent something like that, as well as like circumvent corruption and make sure that like the people that are in charge have their interests tied with working class interests. So in this way, socialism is much more difficult to betray or liquidate from above, is the general idea.
Yep. In general terms, I totally agree with this. People should be educated enough so they could do your basic job or maybe two jobs, but then for a period of 5 or 10 years or something should be put into a bureaucratic office position and do their jobs. But you see, I believe it was the U.S. Rangers who, up until a moment, or another American elite military group, up until a moment, they had like extremely high quality standards. But since the 90s or something, every every politician got in there, and every top official skewed those standards so that everybody could get in. And there was a huge scandal a couple of years ago when this kind of literally spilled into the press, and those people were saying like, yeah, technically we are this elite unit, but actually no, because lots of people who weren't supposed to do, they didn't pass the test, the physical test, the IQ, whatever aptitudes test, they didn't pass them, they were just put in there. Or even worse, we lowered the threshold and we let everybody in because we had to check boxes on a list and stuff like that, and they were friends with all the proper people. So yeah, I do agree that the policy you are talking about might alleviate, but I believe that you really need to come up with something like a thing. You have this thing in socialism, hey, let's be equal and let's split profits. Okay, let's make people educated enough so they can do 2 or 3 different jobs, at least with this level of efficiency. And yes, by doing this, you should have a good chance of taking away all this, shrinking this possibility of things going wrong. But you still need to address the amount of clan grouping and corruption that can take place, and which were like insanely huge problems in Soviet Union and Eastern
Yeah.
Bloc.
To deal with corruption, it's like saying, how do you stop people from murdering? What we need is a total shift towards preventative measures, because the science overwhelmingly supports it, but creating an environment where aberrant behavior doesn't even emerge in the first place, where there's no incentive to do it, is what the top priority should be. Because, I mean, we've been doing punitive justice for thousands of years to no avail. So I think we need to take a preventative medicine or a preventative measure approach by making like a political system that discourages that sort of behavior as much as possible. And that's the reason why, like, through sortition democracy, I see great potential for that. Because, I mean, the people that are chosen for leadership positions aren't being, chosen due to nepotism. I mean, I guess what you're saying is possible, like, where like people in positions of power might lower the standards so that, some of their buddies can get in. But I mean, if it's system but if it's a system that's ultimately based on a dice roll and that candidates are chosen at random, I mean, with that rule in place, that'll make that sort of favoritism impossible. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah, I totally see it, but I believe there was a story in a book of Gabriel Garcia Marquez, 100 Years of Solitude or something, and they were talking about a lottery, and I remember that it was this urn with spheres, and there was this little kid who was supposed to pick the winning sphere, and they would literally it was a marble or stone or something, and they would keep that marble ball in a chiller for a couple of days so that it would be extremely cold, so the kid would get in, would pick the extremely cold ball. So you'd really need to have some people who are highly educated and highly trained in corruption and anti-corruption, like employing the criminals along the not criminals in order to properly combat. So in other terms, you should really think of a method that could work for 1 or 2 decades, and you at the end of 10 or 20 years you should definitely switch the system in order to prevent the people getting too much control of the system.
Yeah, so someone's asking me some questions. How do you determine the standard for who is a liberal or unfit for the job? Well, again, so I would say people that just want to restore market reforms and policies, like this is the reason why free speech is important. That way, rightists, I want an environment where rightists feel comfortable expressing themselves. And, you can express yourself as a rightist, but that doesn't mean we have to like pick you for anything. So that's the first thing. I mean, there is another side of this coin where people just pretend to be left wing. They just hide it, and that's probably what it's going to end up happening. But otherwise, for unfit for the job, you just have standards, IQ tests, just tests, leadership skills, and so on. And I mean, you could also like have people that were already in positions of leadership and authority before. Like if they did an exemplary job, then there's a chance they could come back, But otherwise, it should be as open as possible so that everyone can get those valuable leadership skills. But how random is it? Who can absolutely not be considered? Well, I would say you could have a 3-generation rule. People who can't run for important decision-making bodies would include people that were capitalists in the prior system. And I'm not talking like petty bourgeois. I'm talking like the Warren Buffetts and Bezoses of the world. These people in the new system are not going to be given the levers of power. And I say 3-generation rule. The next 3 generations that these people have kids of, they can't be given levers of power either. Once we're a few generations deep into socialism and their descendants have been born in and lived through social engineering and psychology long enough, then we could consider their direct descendants, after 3 to 5 generations. I don't really have a hard rule on that. What is a SOC-DEM policy and why is pro-market inherently lib? Like hypothetically, if a market were to be needed to solve a problem, or if it weren't bad, why completely ignore it? I mean, that's an excellent question, but when I'm referring to like pro-market policies, I'm mostly referring to letting firms run according to their own profit motive and basically letting them keep their turnover. Like I'm referring to the kind of policies when I was thinking of like Gorbachev, where firms were allowed to keep their turnover and basically run their shit as though it were a capitalist firm. So you just had the emergence of these managerial capitalists within the enterprises. I'm talking about policies like that directly wreck the state and undermine socialism. But otherwise, if markets are needed, like market rationing, if it makes sense to use market rationing for certain consumer goods, then we can have a system of simulated markets, like a simulated market of sorts. Paul Cockshott talks about it. There are a few other planners that do, that could be utilized to basically make a simulated market for adjusting and price rationing consumer goods.
If I may get into the 3-generation argument, here's a problem that I believe it should come up more often in the discussions between leftists. Yeah, technically, you would ban the descendants and the relatives from these extremely rich people from getting into various positions. Okay, sure, that sounds great on paper, but in reality, two things happened. One, sometimes their kids wouldn't be necessarily allowed directly because they were branded as the son of the bourgeois, highly problematic kid and stuff like that. But somehow the anyone in the party could literally forgive this kid, and they would be allowed to go into university, follow and be more than the lowest of the workers, and they would perform very well in the industry, or be a very good aparatsky or bureaucrat, and they wouldn't cause problems. But here is another phenomenon, and this is like you don't find books about this kind of stuff, but this is real thing from the practice. After 20, 30 years after the revolution, after the fall of communism, I read an article about architects complaining, sort of longing for the great old days of the former kings and the great bourgeoisie society, the noble, and how well everything was back then. Oh, by the way, I know you have a debate with Cheshire idiot. He will bring up all this kind of nonsense, retarded, stupid shit. Anyway, so right now, 30 years after the commies, you will have an architect, and somehow that person who is complaining and be dreaming about the long gone days of the kings when everything was so great was a female. The article was signed by a female. And what's the problem with that? There's no problem to feel sorrow and long for the times of the kings, but in reality, in those times, you would, as a woman, you would have like you must have been in the 1% of people who are either rich or very close connected with the rich families in order to get into the architecture university. The thing is, when the communists came, they put the women's, of course, into education system, mandatory, and they allowed them to enter even a higher education form, and of course, access to workforce. So that person, the person who was signing that article, complaining about the good old days, wouldn't have been allowed to get into a proper school. It wouldn't have been allowed to be, most probably, to become an architect, because that was mainly men mainly manly type of job. Okay, so you would have people who are not directly related with, oh, I am the son of this king, I am the nephew of this great baron, and I had properties, and half of this country belonged to me. Okay, you wouldn't have the people who are high nobility. You would have plain idiots, plain citizens, dreaming for the things happening under the kings, but they wouldn't have any access to those level of riches and amenities and goods and stuff like that.
Which is why we need to I want to get through the rest of this list. I feel like we've been on the same topic enough, but what I will say is, which is why we need to make sure that education is as free and available and streamlined as possible. The more educated and uplifted the population is, because reactionary ideology thrives on falsehoods, misinformation, and lies. So what we need to do, on top of like basically making the system reactionary proof as much as possible, we also need to like elevate political education to such a degree to where, like, I'm telling you right now, man, if we just introduced philosophy in grade school, right-wing ideology would be gone within a couple generations' time. I'm convinced that, like, the KKK would go extinct within, like, less than a century if you just introduced philosophy into school. You know what I mean? Just taught people to think critically about things, use their noggins. I feel like you could combat a lot of that.
Yeah, technically on a basic level, I do agree with you. But remember, these people were in no way, shape, or form connected with the rich people dreamt about being noble and kissing the king's ring or foot or shoes or some dumb shit like that, okay? Despite all the efforts done by the government to impose through propaganda and legit facts to educate them about the horrors of the former system. So I believe yes, better education sounds good, but we really need to properly discuss what this better education means, because ultimately you will end up with the same stuff again, and it's not going forward.
This is an interesting idea. Perhaps we should take away parental rights. I mean, if we're gonna go down that realm of path, if you really want to do this like the cruel way, or like the, I guess, if you're gonna take away their kids, I mean, why not just go all the way and have them fucking sterilized so they can't have kids? Like, if you're gonna take away like the right to have kids in the first place, may as well take that rationale to its logical conclusion. I just feel like that's a little bit. I mean, you probably could do it. But I'd rather the system. Like, if we're going to be advocating for socialism, we can't, obviously go around saying we're going to sterilize you and take away your kids. But I don't know. Just a thought. But so I've already talked about the integration of computers and IT. But yeah, no. Using modern information technology, like corporations like of scale today, people will make this argument as though it invalidates this fact, but corporations, through a process of horizontal and vertical integration, do not rely internally on market pressures and price signals with respect to the way that they manage their resources internally. So, and Amazon, mind you, does more complex economic calculation for tens of millions of products than does the Soviet Union. Like, the Soviet Union at its peak only had 50,000 unique commodities, 100,000 unique commodities, while Amazon does economic calculation for tens of millions of unique commodities. So yeah, basically taking the technology that we have in place now with computers and upcoming AI and and 5G information, Internet of Things, we could absolutely plan an economy of scale. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I totally agree. But again, I believe Soviet Union and of course communist regimes were totally able to manage those 50,000 products, different types of products, not different products. But I believe that the problem wasn't that they weren't able to manage, because if you work only with vegetables and fruits, you can easily track them from farm to market. The problem was that everybody was kind of trying to steal and trying to do something on the side, and there is where the real problematic part comes in. Not necessarily that you cannot track. Of course, you can track. You only need a notebook and a crayon and a stencil, a pen, and a phone. And I give you a list. I give you the truck. Drive it to the market. What happens from the moment when you go to the moment when you arrive and how it's sold, those are multiple weak points in this.
So you would also need to tighten up security as well. I know that there's a lot of loss that goes on with modern corporations, but modern economies, like I'm just saying with information technology, loss prevention becomes, and internet network security becomes more tight. So I feel like we could use a lot of the technology we have today to fraud proof the new social system. So issues that were unique to the conditions of the USSR, I feel like there's a lot we have at our disposal today to combat such things. Like, you're talking about what happens between the farm and the market, like between the farmer who makes the food, the driver, and all the way to the market. Well, like I said, using digital tracking, you would actually know what happens, and you would basically be able to narrow down where that stuff is going and who the thief is. Easier anyway. What's up?
Yeah, sure. This technology was very available and accessible, not necessarily tracking with GPS, but this was something available to that era. Police, economic police, even KGB. The problem is they didn't had enough political will. Maybe they didn't have enough interest. Maybe the corruption and the bribery, more probably, were like extremely insanely high, so they failed. But we cannot say, and we shouldn't definitely say, that they couldn't track. They definitely could track everything that was sold. They simply didn't have an interest to track those things.
Actually, I'm just going to speak this out to you. So again, Noob Slayer's asking, would it be by test taking and by yeah. So I know we have degrees for politicians, like you got to go to school for political science, but believe it or not, we really don't have. I feel like there should be a litmus test because there really isn't a litmus test for who can and cannot be a politician in the United States. So I feel like a degree plus like a litmus test of some kind could be introduced as well. But anywho, you were saying?
I was saying about the amount, the huge amounts of corruption that were going on, and yes, you could diminish, limit some of those aspects, but at a certain point, you're talking about the inequalities, wealth and income inequalities between the the medium and top apparatsky bureaucrats and the lower classes. And I believe here, yeah.
Oh, sorry. What else were you saying? I want you to finish.
And I believe, here there is a huge gap in what corruption and what means, because if we judge Soviet Union by the standards of America, you'd say you would need to bribe, I don't know, $1 million or something like that, okay? And you'd come and say, hey, in Soviet Union, you don't have anything, you cannot use $1 million, you simply don't. But the thing is, in Soviet Union, there were plenty of other items which were used for bribery outside of a form of cash, 1 million cash or something like that. Okay, so you would trade with other types of things, material or influence, and that would go outside of the classic model. Yes, my income is 3 times higher than yours, so equality, something. No, ultimately, there was a case in one Eastern Bloc state. If you had access to one pair of jeans, and there were certain citizens which would receive and were able to bring in jeans, the basic jeans, the pants inside the country, they could sell that pair of jeans and live for 6 months by selling one pair of jeans. Okay, so
that's crazy.
Yeah, exactly, and that was something that was tracking up until
those must have been some pretty nice jeans.
No. Usually it was done by the Jewish. It was done by plenty of people, but one classic example is Jewish population minorities would receive such packages from Israel. Okay, and they would use this kind of way to not only supplement but easily live without. In certain cases, not everybody, but that's the insane kind of stuff. So you don't need to have $1 million cash. No, you just need to have 3 pairs of jeans, and you don't have a statistic for how many pair of jeans means equal corruption or something like that. That's
all right. So how to solve foreign trade? Okay, so I mentioned on this list that the abolition of money is something that needs to be done. Now, maybe in like the first couple decades, probably not, but once you've got the infrastructure for moneyless economic calculation and planning to be done, where you do things based on time-based labor credits, that leaves the question, how are we going to trade and participate in global trade on an international scale if, internally we have no currency anymore? And the answer is you would have banking credits. You could use a credit system or just have reserves of like foreign currencies as well, have reserves of resources that are traded. So let's say you got oil, like you're a huge oil exporter. you could just exchange that oil for the global market price, exchanging it for, I don't know, euros, or let's say pesos, or, the Chinese yuan in the future. Belt and Road is a thing. You know, Chinese yuan and the euro are like the two main currencies now. So you could just, if you're a major oil or a major coal exporter, I don't know, you could exchange that for the yuan or the euro, and you could just keep currency reserves. Or, you could also have a system of banking credits as well, where, if we're short on cash, we could just have a banking credit, and, directly exchange resources as well with another nation with something that's relatively similar. Like, we need linen, you need coats. We can trade our coats for your linen, is the idea. But I do want to talk about these last four. Or I want to talk a bit about long-term planning. So, as far as I'm concerned, or I know, the Soviets didn't do like 25-year plans, 30-year plans. They did 5-year plans. They didn't really like how well was their long-term thinking? Just curious. Like,
I believe the majority of their long-term thinking was solely based on the military thing, and not necessarily because they wanted to wage war, but because that was the place, the branch of government of human existence where they had experience and they had processes which were properly refined, and they had a proper culture, the military culture, doctrine and stuff, and they were aware of clear objectives, get independence, get us through Second World War, win the Second World War, get independent and maintain independence. That was something that was like clearly put on paper. But when we are talking about industries, they knew that they had to build industry. I don't think they clearly had any proper clear thing above a certain level of quality. That's why
yeah.
we see all these
So
problems. Because
So when I
yeah,
talk about 20 and 30-year plans, I'm talking about long-term systematic overhauls are that are deliberately drafted for routine changes and overhauls to the economy to address systematic issues that occur, as well as, long-term steps closer to communism as well, like decommodification and so on. But during the 20-year plans, the idea is you plan for technology, you integrate plans for technology that is not currently available, and you make predictions and estimations on how long it will take to develop this technology and make these scientific breakthroughs. And you write future plans contingent on those new scientific breakthroughs coming to pass. And if you don't, of course, you can have a contingency plan for that. But I'm talking about long plans along with short plans. So you have the short plans, and then you have the long plans that are like 20 to 30 years a piece,
oh,
basically.
definitely. And I remember that I got into a Discord server, and there was somebody who was pretty knowledgeable of the Marxist-Leninist theory, and I asked him a question sort of in this general direction. Hey man, can you tell me how can you make long-term plans in such a way that you account for this kind of changes, necessary changes? Because in 20 years, I definitely can foresee, or I know that sort of we will discover a new technology. I don't know what that technology would be, but how can we make a plan into the future, and we leave a gap enough to account, hey, look, this is the gap where a new technology will appear, and how shall we integrate it into a coherent plan? And he wasn't able to talk about that. He kind
Yeah.
of, no, we make 5-year
Yeah.
plans or 10 years, but then some new technology comes and it will throw everything it will
Yeah.
blow up everything.
So yeah, an example of that would be like fusion. Like, let's say I don't know, we're a few decades out, and we could plan for certain breakthroughs to be made with nuclear fusion, and then prepare our energy grid, our electric grid, to accommodate this new energy, as well as certain scientific projects. Because when you have nuclear fusion, you basically have a synthetic star worth of energy, And with that kind of energy, a lot of things become possible. I'm more specifically talking about from galactic space travel standpoint. Suddenly, we could have space stations on Mars and Venus, as well as on, do asteroid mining. We could take rare resources that are very scarce on Earth, like let's say gold, for example, or some other sparsely located like materials like lithium, and we could mine that and transport it back to Earth. So that's the kind of cool things you could do with long-term planning integrated, because I mean, yeah, you're taking a risk. There's a risk that you might not make these scientific breakthroughs in time, but if you're successful, you will exponentially spike resource abundance, like general resource abundance and general levels of wealth and quality of life, leagues beyond, and I mean leagues beyond what capitalism could ever offer.
Yeah, I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
And here is another aspect. I would say that this thing in relation with energy availability and accessibility, I believe it should be made available to you as a as a sort of given. Hey, here are your like 10 kilowatts per month or something, free. And not only to have to browse the internet, but hey, look, here is this workshop. Take your kids there and play with 3D printers, play with powerful computers, do all this crazy stuff so that every kid can and every family could be and should be kept in touch with complex form of technology,
Yeah.
not only what we can
Yeah.
put into our present day schools and stuff like that. And
Yeah.
this can be made available only if there is enough energy, not only from the electric kilowatts or something, but as their manifestation through industrial processes and stuff.
Yeah, the goal is to make the productive forces so advanced and resources so unbelievably abundant, which is something capitalism can never do. But it's the goal is to get to a point to where like disparities in labor quality do not matter anymore, and like differences between people don't matter anymore, and there's no incentive to defraud the system because there's such an abundance of everything that there's plenty to go around. So the goal is to eventually reach a point where trade becomes obsolete. So kind of the futuristic Star Trek society, circular Venus project cities that I envision. That's the goal in about 500 years. But so that brings me to a couple of these points. I want to talk lastly about the eventual and complete implementation of a steady state economy. But first, the deliberate automating and advancing of the productive forces. This is something that America, John Maynard Keynes, do you know who Keynes is? John Maynard Keynes?
Yeah.
So John Maynard Keynes predicted that with the advancing of the productive forces, one of the issues, the reason why we had the Great Depression was there was poverty amongst plenty, was because goods were lasting so long and cyclical consumption couldn't be maintained. Productive forces were advancing and accumulation cycles were breaking down. So what this meant is that had we maintained the path of efficiency and going down, making goods that are durable, that last longer and longer, and advancing the productive forces in the 1930s trend, John Maynard Keynes actually predicted by the year 2000, the average work week would be 15 hours. However, this is not the direction we took. Instead, we shortened the lifespan of all war goods. We shortened the lifespan of everything. We implemented planned obsolescence, as well as the introduction of the service economy, having people run around like a solid sect of our population just doing shit, basically to keep people working and keeping the capitalists super wealthy. So under socialism, there should be, in my eyes, there should be a deliberate goal to automate and shorten the work week as much as possible, and because I think with our current technological productivity, and my evidence for this is the 2020 depression. All right, so my evidence for the fact that we could shorten the work week down to about 25 hours is in the fact that we had a third of our workforce out of work for like 3 months straight last year. During the recession, the COVID recession, everyone was just living on unemployment, and yet society was functioning as normal. 30% of the population was out of work getting paychecks from the government, and our stores were stocked. Our food was available. People could go about and live their regular lives as though like nothing happened, as though there wasn't even a crisis in the first place. And the reason for this is because we are so industrially productive as a civilization that we can tolerate like 30% of our workforce being out of work. And it just goes to show like how much people are just pointlessly kept doing shit just for the sake of keeping the capitalists rich. And I also think it's to keep people from rebelling. But yeah, that's the general idea. Cut the work week in half. Make it so that overtime doesn't start until 20 hours, 25 hours, and raise wages. This is a short-term reform that I think we should really fight for now. But I'm sorry for running my mouth.
No, you made a great point. See, my issue with that might be my issue with that sort of this Eastern type of, hey, here's a problem, always wagging my finger to a problem I encounter. I wouldn't shorten the work week that fast. I would make we should connect it with the previous point in which you kind of take one worker and make him do 2 or 3 jobs, so you have your working regular job A doing I don't know, something in the steel mill for 3 days, and then you should go into a sort of supervision role to supervise things around in the next days, maybe 6 hours in the 4th day and 4 hours in the 5th day or something like that, very short shifts. So then you would have people going around and still be active as a sort of transition stage, because if you put too many people out of their jobs, they will get ideas, and I'm not sure
Yeah,
if the government is
that's exactly what I'm saying. The only reason we work as much as we do is because it's a way of social control. Look what happened during the 1960s when they were scaling back work weeks. We got Woodstock. We got the counterculture movement. We had an upsurge in political activity that was threatening and challenging the establishment. And of course, we had Vietnam. But I'm just saying, like, I mean, and look what fucking happened when we had the COVID 2020 crisis. Here's what happened. Everyone is out of work. Everyone's unemployment. And then what do they see? A video of a man being publicly executed. All of a sudden, protesting and rioting everywhere. A massive emergence in class consciousness. And part of the reason why that is because people have the time to think about these things. People aren't as concerned with bills. People aren't, running around doing shit needlessly. They have time to think about the world around them. They have time to actually, want to do something, because when someone's stressed out working 50 or 60 hours, they don't have time to think about what's going on in the world around them. They don't have time to think deep. But when you have a third the workforce out, now they have that time. Now they have that time to actually lash out. And that's why they were rushing to get everybody back to work, basically.
Yep, exactly.
Yeah, you hit the nail on the head. So how about we also address our responsibilities towards consumptive ends? If we want to be responsible and owners of our production, we can't ignore our duty as... Yeah, exactly. So this is where... That's actually on the last point of this list, which is the complete transformation of our infinite growth consumption economy into a steady state zero growth economy, where we are basically recycling the Earth's resources and integrating our economic activity within the biosphere itself, because Mother Nature wastes nothing. Everything gets recycled and reused in nature. And if we are going to have an economy that can last for millennia to come, then we're going to need to design an economy that actually functions and aligns itself with our ecosystem and integrates itself into our earthly habitat in a sustainable manner. This means not making t-shirts and pairs of shoes that are designed a couple weeks before they get torn or broke or ripped and then thrown in a landfill just so that you can continue the turnover and generate more profit. This means not having, this means actually designing goods, consumer goods that can be updated or last a long time. Like you brought up the example with smartphones or with iPhones. The reason why they do that generational shit where you have to basically buy a new phone every other year, then they design them deliberately to be difficult to fix and repair. And why they don't just make phones that are indestructible that can be updated is because they're trying to generate that turnover. And eventually, because this is unsustainable, in the future, we're either going to have a steady state socialist planned economy, or we're going to have basically a rentier system of vampire capitalism where goods are designed to last. Goods are designed, but there's no economic growth. Capitalism without growth. It's just capital recycling, basically. And they just charge rents in order to use everything. So, we do have our indestructible greenhouse cars and our green energy and green shit. But the difference is that you have to pay to rent all of it. That's what they were talking about, the Great Reset. You own nothing and you will be happy. That's what they mean by it. That they're just going to go full rentier vampire capitalism, basically.
Yeah, totally agree with what you say. And here is another aspects I believe it's also important. Right now we see this narrative about immigrants as a workforce, immigrants good, immigrants bad. Each side of the political spectrum has an opinion. But my issue is in all these discussions, immigrants are being treated like soulless robots. They are dehumanized. Oh, bring those pesky immigrants and use them in our economy to work and produce in our factory. What the fuck are they? Are we talking about slaves here? Like that's insane. So we again have to bring it down to what sort of human being, how this new system should treat human. Because ultimately, I see it as a form of social contract. Yes, I know it is a mythical thing that nobody saw up until now, but I believe socialism should, or at least socialists, people on the left like you and me, should start speaking up about this new social contract and what it should employ. Because treating people just like machines, hey, go work in the factory and take your money and shut the fuck up, is like extremely dismissive. And ultimately, I believe that the system will collapse in itself. It doesn't have any value for building something higher. So that's why I believe we need to start the discussion about how we are going to propose this human to engage with the society we are proposing. Hey, come into my society either as a local born citizen or from whatever other country. But if you put in this much amount of work, what will you receive? What sort of quality of things will you have access to? And if these things are absent, then that I would call that system as crappy.
Yeah. So I completely agree with you. The social contract does need to be maximized. What we need is the transformation of values. The capitalist will sell you the rope with which you can hang them with. And I think that the proliferation of a new socialist culture, like a new socialist counterculture, at least in America, is actually pretty ripe. I'm sorry to say, my Eastern European friend, but I actually think revolutionary potential in Eastern Europe is at an all-time low. I think that America is more likely to go communist within the next century than Eastern Europe is. I'm not going to lie.
Don't be sorry. We are on the same page here.
Yeah,
lots of brainwashing and propaganda going on.
Yeah, but here in America, the propaganda is starting to break. Things are changing. More and more people are starting to identify as socialists and agree with socialism because, we're in the belly of the beast. We see the sickness. We might not feel the grind of exploitation. We do, but really it's the alienation. It's just the disconnectedness and atomization. So I think there's a number of reforms that I think are worth struggling for in the short term. But as for revolution has always happened in the weak links of global capitalism. So when I think of countries that are most likely to be socialist within the coming decades, the top of my list is India, and a close second would be the African countries and Southeast Asia. Those are like pretty much the three because they're the most exploited and beat down and colonized, and I mean, and they also have like, at least India has very strong communist presence. If any country on earth is going to have a socialist revolution this century, it is going to be India. Because
Okay,
what?
let me throw this ball to you. So Soviet Union and of course commies in the Eastern Europe came to power and they achieved so many great things. Of course, some with but a great cost, but they achieved them. Okay, but what I would say compared to how many and how high was the amount of things achieved, equally high was the amount of things at which they failed ultimately. So do you think that these new systems, like countries like India or other places, can come up not necessarily with the same amount of achievements, but with that with the difference between achievements and failures? Do you think can be different in a better way than it was in Soviet Union?
I believe that India has a slightly better base than Russia did. I mean, they're still a relatively backward country, but it's third world. There are pockets of India, like, I mean, like what, 40% of the population gets like 2,000 calories or less per day. They basically are on starvation calories. There's extremely unequal development. Some of the provinces are wealthy, many of them are in squalor. And the provinces that are largely controlled by communists are the ones that are like they're friendlier to workers and they're actually breeding grounds for communist activity. I mean, it's a hard call. I would say if the African countries formed a Soviet Union of their own, I would actually say Africa has the potential, not India, but Africa definitely has the potential to overtake and completely surpass the Soviets in their achievements, just because, I mean, well, one, Africa is an extremely rich, vast, expansive region of the world. And I would say that's one reason. The other is just because, like, they have a lot more people than the Soviets did during their time. I have reason to suspect that if Africa went socialist or there was a block of socialist countries in Africa, that it would probably end up being the Soviet Union all over again, because they'll just get encircled. But the good news is that they have the resources and the manpower and eventually the technological developments that I actually think they could outdo the Soviets as a project. And I think that India has a similar amount of potential as well. But no, Africa, if they went socialist, would literally dominate this fucking planet within a few decades' time, just because of how wealthy and people don't realize like how wealthy Africa is, like how much resources they have available. There's a reason why like the colonial powers and now China have been penetrating the continent for centuries, you know.
Yeah, I agree with the resource part, but with having an abundance of resources, there is also a curse of having those resources because you kind of have to pick and choose if you develop industries to deal with the resources and through how many steps and hoops and loops you have to go through in order to make them proper goods to be sold at a proper profit margin and stuff like that to other countries or to be exchanged, because this was something happening also in Soviet Union. Soviet Union had lots of resources, and some of those resources in after the 50s and 60s kind of started to dry out, and they were having issues, and they were imposing their will into their neighboring countries, and the Soviet Union sort of transformed into this kind of space where the center was eating more resources that was giving out to the places where it took from. Okay, so that was a problem. The curse of having resources is like with the oil and the agriculture in Venezuela, which are very low as products as I mean talking
Well,
as a term of profit.
You're not wrong. That's the thing. Sorry, I turned off the camera because I'm changing my clothes, but I'm about to kill the stream here in a minute. But what I will tell you is that you are correct, and it goes back to what I was saying earlier about productivism. The Soviets got caught up in productivism. They didn't try to get as much out of what they had. Instead, they just focused on, just trying to grow and produce as much as possible. They over prioritized heavy industry after a certain point. So when those resource reserves were starting to run dry in the 70s, they started importing them from like the neighboring Soviet republics. So, but I am going to let you know that I'm going to have to end this stream now because I have a Pathfinder game I got to run soon. And plus, this wasn't really meant to run longer than like an hour and a half, anyways. So,
Well, I enjoyed the conversation. Let's pick it up again because there is lots of things with Soviet KGB corruption and how things really worked in reality we didn't address.
yeah. So,
Okay.
how about this? We could collaborate on this if you want. Or would you rather do it on your channel?
We can let's have a collab. I don't mind my channel, your channel.
All
I
right.
would like to have you on my channel for an interview, but on this topic of material things from the Soviet Union, we can do it both places. I don't have a problem.
All right. Well, everybody, thank you for joining me today. So I'm happy to have you on. I'm always happy to have a subscriber on to talk to, but from now on, I'm going to make sure these things are premeditative. I'm not going to do what I did during the ML stream and just make it an open invite because I mean, bunch of fucking trolls just came on, so it's going to be premeditated for now on. But yeah, I'm going to kill the stream. Thanks for joining me, guys. Have a nice day, comrades.
See ya.